Hey folks, it's Rob Flux here from Property Developer Network for another Sunday session. Now in this instance, we have pre-recorded it, given that we've actually had some technical issues last Sunday when we went to go live. Today's topic is all about construction costs in the current economic climate, and more specifically, I guess, having a builder's perspective on, I guess, what's happening, why it's happened, and where things are going to go. So with that in mind, please welcome Henry Vila from Stone Horizon, mate. So my humble apologies. Welcome, Henry, again.
No problem. Happy to be here. Here we are in Stone Horizon's headquarters. We call this the jungle room. It's a bit of a kind of thinking space. So hopefully we'll have a good conversation today.
Absolutely, mate. And it looks much better than any fake virtual background. So you actually had me fooled first go.
Real, yeah.
So, mate, we're going to be talking about construction costs in the current climate, and more specifically, the fact that they've climbed so much in the last 2 years or so. But before we go into that, I guess we want to give some perspective to everybody about why you're the go-to guy to actually listen to, because you're coming from both a builder's perspective and also a developer's perspective. So, mate, tell me a little bit about yourself and also Stone Horizon, and I guess why, the information that people are going to be listening to, why it has such context coming from you.
Sure. I think it actually makes sense for people to understand a little bit where our comments and our conversation is going to come from. So listen, I started my career in property as an investor, like many of the people kind of in the community. I probably started doing sort of the raw and negative sort of deals that everyone kind of probably start at, but very, very quickly I turned into property development as my kind of core strategy. And then it was only after a while that I became a builder. I was incredibly frustrated for not finding the right quality of builders out there that could, service me and create a product at the quality that I wanted without it being incredibly painful or incredibly expensive. So we decided we could do it better. So we went through the whole process of becoming a builder, which seems to be even more painful every day. But that has given us those two perspectives. So I obviously build projects for other people, but I also do my own projects. Now, Stone Horizon is a company that designs, builds, and operates cash flow properties for investors. Now, some of the people in your community might remember that the last time that I was here, I presented as part of Trescore Group. Trescore Group is still pretty much there. That's the overarching group that holds the three operating companies that we operate, Stone Horizon being, cash flow properties and smaller developments. Then there's a company in the middle called Franco Buildings that does the rest of multi-units, anything 2, 3, 4, 15 townhouses. And then there's a third company that does commercial developments and medium-rise apartments. So that gives us a pretty broad perspective in the construction industry, and everything from the really small projects to the much bigger ones and everything in between.
So really good broad range, mate. So you're going to be able to talk a heck of a lot about why things have actually occurred. Now, let's go back in time a little bit. So 2 years ago, before COVID actually happened, building costs were a little bit more expensive than we would like, but they were predictable, right? And since COVID, we've had a whole bunch of things happen with supply chains, availability of materials. We had the bushfires in Australia, impacting the timber industry, and a whole bunch of things like that. Give me some insights into, I think the last time I heard it, we've had a 20+% increase in construction costs. You've probably got a better visibility on the actual stats on that.
Yeah, listen, it's been a painful 2 years, right? I don't think there's any way of hiding from it. There's any way of sugarcoating it. That's just been the reality. And it's been the reality for everybody, right? It's been incredibly painful for builders, and it's been incredibly painful for developers. Construction costs have gone a little bit crazy for a couple of reasons, right? The first reason is supply chain. You just mentioned it there. Obviously, the disruption to the economies of the world all at the same time have meant that the typical trade routes and supplier kind of relationship that exists in the world, they're all kind of pretty much out of balance, and it will take quite a while for those things to kind of get back to normal. The other thing is that a lot of the economies in the world, many of the developed countries in particular, have decided, including Australia, that property was one of the mechanisms for us to weather their storm. So when expenditure, like discretionary expenditure, kind of gets limited, you can't go out, you can't go to the movies, you can't travel, investment tends to cope. And they went and put a whole bunch of subsidies into property. We saw it here pretty heavily, with the government putting a lot of money and a lot of kind of incentives into property. But the same thing happened everywhere else in the world, which meant that demand for new houses, demand for new property, new developments increased massively, making even harder the pressures that were already in the supply chain. So,
I might dive into each one of those in a little bit more detail. Supply chain, people go, yeah, big deal, supply chain, right? But in reality, we need to kind of break it down into little elements. We all know that we've been going through lockdowns. Every single country has been going through a lockdown. So if we can imagine that at the place of the raw materials being pulled out of the ground, there's a lockdown, that causes a delay, right? And that then has to go onto some sort of shipping container to get to the manufacturer. That's going to have a delay. Then the manufacturer has to do some stuff. They're going to have a lockdown. That's another delay. When you start compounding all of this, I guess that lag between the raw materials coming out of the ground and it getting to site has had massive implications. And then the cost of doing that just on things like, international shipping routes and things like that. I know that the cost of containers they went 2.5 times the cost of a 40-foot shipping container at one point. So, you're compounding all of these things together just in the logistics supply chain. So the cost of manufacturer may not necessarily have changed, but the implications of that down the food chain have been massive.
Yeah, absolutely. And listen, it's one of those things where people don't realize that when these delays get compounded with each other, they actually multiply, right? And this actually, by the way, happens also in traditional construction and in development more broadly, right? So, if we get a week delay, like you said, material coming out of the ground, and then a week delay, in production, and then a week delay in shipping, people do the math and say, well, 1 week there, 1 week there, 1 week there, my thing should be 3 weeks late. But that's actually not the way it happens, because these delays actually compound themselves. The reality is, when a manufacturing plant, doesn't have the raw materials to go and manufacture Tupperware, for example, that week of manufacturing is gone. The capacity is gone. You can't produce the stuff that you were meant to produce last week, because this year you have other stuff to produce. So those things get super compounded to the point where, the stuff the raw materials might not have changed, although in many cases they have, but they might not have. Manufacturing costs might not have changed. The actual shipping, the actual cost of taking a ship from China to here might not have changed, but the supply is so constrained that the demand actually makes the prices go up, right? You're completely right. Shipping containers, 2.5 times for a shipping container at some point during the pandemic was actually a good outcome. Many people were, no shipping containers, full stop, right? It doesn't matter how much you were willing to pay. So there's a point where, the system is so clogged. It's like one of those big traffic jams when there's a big stack in the freeway, right? It doesn't matter what happens, no one's moving, even though at the end there might actually be a place to go through. That to normalize.
That perfect example you just gave with an accident on the freeway, even when the accident's disappeared, sometimes hours later, people are still slowing down to where the accident used to be, because it's got this concertina effect that actually happens. So it takes a while to re-normalize. So that's kind of the first problem. Then the second problem, as you said, is all the governments around the world decided that I guess the construction industry was the way to kickstart the economy. And I can speak to Australia. The construction industry, both directly and indirectly, is the largest employer of people in the country. So by the time you have, I guess, the builders, and then I guess the subbies, then there's agents, then there's property managers, then there's finance people, then there, when you start to actually compound that, for every one house that gets built, it's probably creating like 7 or 8 jobs. And so it's a really easy way when government says, well, let's just throw some money at it to kickstart the economy. And then you do that with every country around the planet, and then all of them are wanting the same supplies at the exact same time. On top of that compounded supply chain issue, and of course, that's going to create massive demand in product.
That's correct. And listen, and the reality is, and I know we're going to talk a little bit, both now and in the presentation we're going to do live in about a month, about some of the stuff that we do sort of internationally, where we go and trying to learn from what other countries do, and I'm very close to a group of builders in the United States and stuff. So they got a point where I was complaining to them about the fact that my timber bill was basically double what it's been, a few months before, right? And everyone laughed at me, Rob, because I went, well, that's a bit rude, It's like, what's happening here? And they want to say, man, we wish we were paying double. They were paying 4 times more, because in the case of the American system, a bit different to what they're here, they don't have the regulatory controls that we have here. They don't have fixed price contracts. They have a whole bunch of things that makes the volatility of a lot of those materials a lot bigger. Now, we need to understand that, when we have lockdowns in Australia, we depend more heavily on imported stuff. So if you're a timber mill in Thailand, do you prefer to sell your timber to the United States for 4 times more, or to Australia for 2 times more? And that actually compounded the effect of, increased demand globally, we wanting more of it because we're building more extra houses, and there being less and less of that, both because of supply chain and because, traditional market forces.
And that timber side of things was compounded by the fact that at the start of 2021, and it's almost forgotten now, but we had some of the biggest bushfires on Earth, which then took out all of our timber reserves. And so our own local supply chains got impacted. So, it's almost the perfect storm of things that all came together to, I guess, cause the current issues. So, mate, obviously there's a lot of different materials that have been impacted differently, including labour. But what are the materials that you've seen the most impacted?
Yeah, listen, let's talk about materials first, and then we can talk a little bit about labor, right? So in terms of materials, there's a number of them, but the ones that create the biggest impact on the actual construction cost, if you like, and in the completion of construction is probably in 3 areas. The first one is timber. We already spoke a little bit about it. We're probably expected to pay double, if not more, for the timber we put in there, depending on the combination of, how much is pine, how much is LVL. It gets a little bit boring like that. The second thing is probably steel. Now, depending on the type of projects that you're doing, you might use a fair bit of steel in a project, or you might use only a little bit. If you are one of those persons that is using a fair bit, you're probably going to be impacted in terms of your construction cost. Steel is a bit of a weird one because the price of steel went up during the pandemic, and then it started to come down. But because of the supply chain issues that we were talking about a moment ago, we haven't still seen those prices normalize. We're still paying a lot more than we perhaps wanted to. And to be honest, I'm not sure those prices are going to go back to pre-pandemic levels ever again, but we expect they will normalize. The third group of things is basically anything coming from China. And again, in most cases, prices in China haven't actually increased that much unless they have a significant commodity component like steel or some other metal. But the price increases in China haven't been huge. But the supply chain component of it means there's less stuff coming out of China, which means that market forces, offer and demand, supply and demand means that prices have increased, but it's also where the biggest impact in terms of timelines for a project might be. Now, if you have a builder that is intelligent and then knows how to move the market, and you work with him, chances are you will prefer to pay a little bit more for things to compensate for the lack of availability. And that means, there's going to be a cost impact through that process that needs to manage.
So that's interesting that it's timber and steel, because when you've got a shortage of timber, one of the really tempting things to do is to say, well, let's go for an alternate material, and the alternate material is steel frames, right? Now, how much of that do you think is the raw cost of steel going up, and how much of that do you think is the fact that the demand has gone up because the timber wasn't available?
Listen, the reality is in the commodity market still went up like crazy, really. Now, is it in the same proportion that we got hit by? No, I'm pretty sure there's some supply chain stuff there. I'm pretty sure there's some availability stuff there. But let me talk a little bit about what you just said about, well, we used to use timber and then, we kind of switched to steel, right? And this is a very Victorian perspective, because to be honest, I don't know what's happening in the rest of the country. So for you guys, it might be a little bit different. But as soon as the pandemic hit and timber started being a problem for builders in general, we managed to plan around it. But for other builders, it became a really, really big issue. I started getting calls from people trying to sell me, steel frames, right? So, there's no steel, so you should buy this steel frame here and that steel frame there. And we reckon it's now going to be cheaper. Now, steel frames have been around forever, or at least for a long, long time. And they never stack up financially. So I think what happened during the pandemic is, good sales marketing people use it as an opportunity to kind of push their product, which, has some advantages, but cost doesn't seem to be one of them. Now, to me, in my numbers, in my projects, for my clients, and that's very important to clarify there, steel never stacked up. Not even in the middle of the pandemic. It was still more expensive, and the alleged sort of time saving aspect of it that was kind of trotted out there, like I said, by steel frame organizations, was true in the frame, but it created a whole bunch of extra complications after. So you don't do plaster the same way, you don't do roughings the same way. It slows down some other elements. So I thought it makes sense for me to just put out there that people think the solution is steel, and in some cases it might be, but not in every case.
Yeah. So then I guess the final element is clearly labor. Now, labor is I'm going to say a function of every I guess homeowner on the face of the planet getting the $25,000 government free swing to say, hey, I want to build a house right now. So every labourer went, well, if I'm in so much demand, I'm just going to ratchet my price.
Yeah, let me talk about why first, and then we can talk about where we're at now. And I think we're actually getting to a slightly better place, even though we're not quite there. So there's a number of factors that played into it, right? So offer and demand, right? If there's 3 competitors and then 5 works for 5 of them, then they're just going to be able to charge whatever they want, right? And this is where, for someone like me, it's super useful to have a stable, solid crew that works with me all the time, because there's some relationship equity there that we can trust from each other. So that's one of them. The second thing, and this will sound incredibly surprising for a lot of people, but once we got things like Job Seeker and some of those subsidies, a lot of them decided they didn't want to work anymore. Right? So they're like, no, sorry, man, I'm not actually, I don't actually need the job. So talk to me in 2022, right? And that obviously created a shock, particularly with some of the contingent labor, some of the, not necessarily the regulars that work in every project, but the people that, you use to kind of, handle the peaks, if you like. They're like, no, sorry, not doing it. And then the third impact, a little bit later in the pandemic, was vaccination. this is not about making a political point about any of those things. The reality is that there's people who had no issue getting vaccinated, no issue kind of complying with all the rules and regulations, etc., that got imposed in construction really, really early and really, really strongly. Some people did. Some people were like, no, I prefer to not have a job than to go and comply with some of those rules. And that means that those people were not available kind of, to do the work they needed to do. So, increased demand and supply got even more shrunk than we were already, because the reality is we've had a supply shortage on really good trades for quite a number of years. It's not just a pandemic thing. It just got exacerbated by it.
Yeah. So that middle point that you made about the job keeper package, that's an unintended consequence. The government was trying to do the right thing. They're trying to say, look, we want to make it possible for you to maintain a job if your employer is not able to keep you employed. But there were some people who, I'm going to be blunt here, took the piss, right? They went, well, if I'm going to get paid without working, why should I work, right? And I understand why some people might do that, but I guess the ethical people were still pushing through. But then sometimes people were getting paid more to sit at home and do nothing than they were to actually go to work, and so it was disincentive.
Absolutely, and I think that's actually part of the problem. So it didn't impact everyone the same way. So as anyone listening to this will probably understand, when you hire, say, a carpentry crew or a plumbing crew or an electricity crew, you have people with different levels of experience, and those people tend to make different levels of money, right? So you have apprentices who are just still learning and working and getting paid for it, but definitely not as much as a 25 years of experienced carpenter, that sort of stuff. The whole job keeper thing impacted the bottom of that group more severely than anybody else. So not only it was an issue of we don't have enough people, but now the people that we have is actually the most expensive people, and maybe the people who haven't done some of those activities in quite a while, right? I know my plumbers get their apprentices to go and cut pipes and go on and do some of those things. They probably haven't done it themselves in years, to be honest. Now it's like, well, apprentice decided he didn't want a job anymore. So now it's us, right? So that created a whole bunch of not only less people on site, but also people that needed to get used to a slightly different way of working compared to where they were. Now the good news is that's changing. Well, I guess the good news is it's changing. The bad news is why it's changing. With all these cost increases going up, and we might talk a little bit about later about how to manage it and some of those things. But the reality is there's a lot of builders out there who are in significant distress, right? And the amount of insolvencies in construction has increased just this year, and we're early March, 40% compared to last year. That was pretty bad to start with.
And that's coming off a high base because as it stands as an industry, 1 in 5 builders go broke. So then you're adding a 40% load on top of that. Now it's almost 2 in 5 going broke. So all of this is compounded. And the reason why it's compounded is because as an industry, the financiers only will finance when they know that there's a fixed price contract involved. So developers want certainty in their outcomes, and so that all gets pushed onto the builder, who has to give a fixed price quote. The cost of labor's gone up, the cost of materials have gone up, his price point hasn't gone up, and so he's wearing the risk. And in many instances, as you've said, they're starting to go insolvent at massive rates, which then creates a whole bunch of challenges. Now, as a developer, we don't want our builder to go broke, because if our builder goes broke, we then have to find another builder. That other builder doesn't want to take on somebody else's work. That builder already has a huge amount of workload on, so their rates are going to go up. So there's a whole bunch of things that we need to do to kind of work with our builders so that they don't go broke. And that, I guess that's kind of the next part of this conversation, Henry, is to say, well, as a builder, what are some of the things that you're doing to try and encourage the developers or the people that are engaging your services? What are you trying to do to encourage them to keep you alive? Because legally, we're entitled to a fixed price quote. So if I wanted to hold my guns and go, mate, you owe me, you promised, I could do that, but if you do, you're going under. So it's not in my best interest to send you broke.
Yeah. Listen, let me start by setting the scene with just one phrase, which everyone hearing to this won't be surprised me saying it, but it needs to be said, right? In the property game, right? Everything from, probably with the exception maybe of real estate agents, but everyone from a developer to the builder to every person who buys the stuff, the person that is subject to most regulation, rightly so, by the way, is the builder. Yeah. Most of the risk in our development, it's actually not with the developer, it's actually with the builder. Yeah. In the sense that any variation, any change in circumstances, any surprises, by default and by law, are rely with the builder. Now, like everything, there's a light side of the conversation, and then there's a dark side of the conversation, right? So one of the things that you learn if you're a good builder very early on is how to manage all this stuff, because there's actually ways of managing it. But like everything, there's good ways of doing it, there's bad ways of doing it, right? You are completely right? The regulation, prohibits any clause in a contract that effectively becomes an escalation clause, right? And I've seen them written, I've seen builders write it in actual physical contract where they say, oh, well, if my price of timber goes up more than 10%, then the owner will pay. You might write it, a lawyer might write it, it might sound great. The client, the developer might agree to it, but that clause is illegal. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't have an agreement with the builder, but it's just not enforceable in the contract, right? So now that means that there's builders who'll be doing one of two things, either being pushing people down, it's almost like holding the developer at ransom, really, when I hear some of the stuff that are happening. Or you can do kind of what we do, which is one, try to avoid the thing happening in the first place by actually trying to control cost. And that doesn't mean just cutting corners or doing any of that stuff. It means trying to predict what the real cost of this project is actually going to be. A lot of people listening to this will have remembered that I presented some of the stuff that we do to try to predict construction costs when we were in the meeting in Melbourne last year. We created all of that to try to predict things like this and not happen in the first place, albeit no one can really predict a pandemic. But the other way to manage this is just to have an open conversation, right? Sometimes contractually open when you go and do, I guess everything from a cost plus, which I know finance companies don't like by any means. But sometimes you need to have maybe a couple of provisional sums that reduce some of the risk to the builder. Maybe you can have some prime costs there that allow you both the builder and the developer to share the risk. Because the reality is, if you're asking all your builder to run all the risk, he's actually going to charge you for it. So that's only going to contribute to the cost increasing. If I don't know if something is going to cost $10 or $100, I cannot sell it to you for $10, right? I need to put some contingency in there because the prices will move, and you will actually not run any of the risk. So,
yeah. So there's one point that you made there with regards to the escalation clause being illegal. I guess for a point of clarification, just want to say you're based in Victoria, so that's definitely the case in Victoria. It might be different in other states, so I guess make sure that you can actually sanity check that. But then you threw in a couple of, I guess, bits of terminology, mate, that many of our audience have probably heard, but they don't actually understand. So So prime cost and provisional sum, and a lot of people get those two confused. So maybe you can just give us some insights into the two of those.
Yeah, listen, I'm sorry for getting to first thing, apologies. I'm Victorian, so anything that comes out of my mouth has a Victorian, angle to it. I know about some of the other stuff in other countries, but sorry, in other states, but just assume everything I'm saying is true in Victoria, and it may or may not be true everywhere else. Now,
Queensland's like another country, mate.
Now let's talk a little bit about prime cost and provisional sums. And apologies for the jargon. It's just something which, by the way, if you're a developer, you probably need to get used to it. So if you don't know what those are, pay attention. Next 30 seconds will change your life. Yeah. A provisional sum and a prime cost are, for the normal guy out there, exactly the same thing. Okay? They're actually not different. They work the same way. They have the same effect. Yeah, which is probably why they're so confusing. The difference between them is what goes in each bucket, what's named what. So anything that the builder buys and puts in the property pretty much as is, things like appliances and any sort of materials and things like that, are called prime cost. Anything that is a subcontractor or labor or any of those estimates, it's called a provisional sum. But the reality is they both behave the same way. They're a budget that the buyer, the developer and the builder agree to include in the contract, but that budget is flexible. So if Rob and I agree that we're going to put $1,000 for a kitchen cooktop here, and that's what's in the contract, if it turns out that the cooktop costs $2,000, then that extra $1,000 that is not in the contract, it's paid for by the developer. So effectively, the builder runs no risk for anything that is a provisional sum or a prime cost. Whereas in a pure fixed price contract, any changes in prices are bear for by the builder. Does that make sense, Rob? Do you think that kind of plays out?
Absolutely. And it's because of that, I'm anticipating that what the builders are trying to do now with all their new contracts is to try to move as much as humanly possible into those two categories to allow for that flexibility of material, which technically gets around that escalation clause, but in a fairly loose way.
It does, and it does exactly the opposite to what a fixed price contract does. Because now the developer is running 100% of the risk. And that historically, depending on the builder, has been, let's say inadequate. And what I mean by that is, if a builder knows that the owner or the developer is now running all the risk, then there's no real incentive for the builder to control cost, really. And I'm not saying that every builder out there wouldn't do the right thing. We certainly will manage them very closely. But I prefer arrangements where things are kind of managed together, where people get around a table and kind of they try to find solutions that create a good outcome for everybody. And unfortunately, at the moment, the regulation has nothing like that other than a pure sort of negotiated outcome in good faith.
And so I guess that's some changes that are now almost commonplace in contracts around the place to allow for the increase in materials. It doesn't really cater for the increase in labour costs and that sort of thing. So what are builders trying to do to try and cater for that?
Listen, I can tell you what I'm doing, right? So for me, it's all about planning, right? And because if I end up escalating the price of my contract, whether it's legally or by negotiation or through a provisional sum, I know, being a developer myself, that all I'm doing is not producing the outcome that the developer needs, right? And that's why we're here ultimately. We're here to create value to developers, obviously including ourselves as developers there. So we find that the only real way to do, to control this stuff is to plan ahead. When we plan ahead, the team that we use, we have about 110 people that we use in our projects. If you count the direct relationships and then the main subcontractors. All of those guys are with us all the time. They do all our projects, same plumbers, same electricians, same painters, same plaster. So crew, we use them all the time. So what we do is the same way that I need to work with the developer to try to control cost and to get a right outcome. On the back, in that room, I'm actually sitting with my trades and with my subcontractors and one of my suppliers to try to predict cost increases before they happen. So that way we can manage it, right? So that way I can price the project up properly. I think this year there's going to be more builders going out of business for pricing projects too cheap than any other reason. I think most builders out there, they don't actually know how much construction costs have gone up. They're just pricing the same way that they used to price last year. And what's happening is once you mix that with a price contract and a variable workforce and increasing materials, it's an explosive mix.
Yeah, absolutely. Which then means that, and we touched on it before, as the developer or homeowner engaging in a building contract being done either way, if your builder goes broke, what can we do to work with you to stop that happening? Because the biggest pain point for us is, well, now I have to actually find a replacement builder. All the builders are busy. Those builders, because they're busy, they're going to ratchet their price points up because they don't need the work. So they're only going to come on board if you pay the extra premium. And on top of that, they're taking on, I guess, the inherent risk of picking up a project that's half done, and they don't know the quality of the work that's been done. So as a developer, we're going to have massive increase in holding costs while we wait for that builder, while we find them and source them. We're going to have increase in costs with regards to the cost of the construction to complete, and that's an unknown quantity, as opposed to having a good chat with someone like you, Henry, and say, mate, I can see it's going to cost me if you go under. Can I keep you afloat? Because it's probably cheaper than letting you go under and then going through the hassle of trying to find someone to replace you.
Yeah, listen, I'm clearly a builder, so take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt, right? But this is why you don't pick just the cheapest builder out there. Yeah. Unfortunately, developers, particularly first-time developers or novice developers, they don't really know how to evaluate what a good builder looks and feels like. Yeah? So, but everyone knows how to compare a price. So a lot of people just do that. Well, I don't know if this guy's good or that guy's good, but this guy's $100 cheaper, so I'm going to go there, right? If you're listening to anything I'm saying today, listen to this. Yeah, you need to have a strong relationship with your builder well before you put a shovel in the ground, because that's the only thing that can save you from a disaster like the ones we're describing, right? So once the builder is in trouble, you can do some things to help, but hardly you'll get back to normal, right? I think the statistics on projects what we call project recoveries, which is a problem where they run into financial trouble and then recover to a successful end, I think it's about 1 in 4. Yeah? So that means that the other 3, no matter what they did, some didn't do anything, some tried to do some things, they still ended up in distress. And like you said, Rob, so finding a second builder is going to be way harder than finding the first one the right way and the right builder the first time, because no one wants to take on somebody else's project, particularly not from a builder that is about to go out of business, right? Because there's a whole lot of things that cannot be seen, and probably there's a risk that corners being cut, and that second builder is taking liability for the whole project, not just the bit that they're doing, right? So the later you are in the project, the actually more risky it is for the new builder. So have a strong relationship with your builder, and keep the lines of communications open. Your builder should tell you if he's in trouble before you know. If you're finding out because tradies are calling you because the guy hasn't been paid, or because there's no transparency in the project, then you probably don't have the right builder to start with.
Well, there's, whether they're talking to you or not, there's signs and symptoms that you can see. So You just mentioned one tradie's giving you a call to say why I haven't been paid. But there's physically turning up to site every week and going, why is the progress slowed down? Why is there no materials here? Why are there no tradies on site? Those little clues are giving you an insight that the builder's got a cash flow issue, and that they're not able to buy the supplies, they're not able to pay the tradies. And if a tradie's not getting paid, then he's typically not going to want to turn up.
Absolutely.
The cash flow typically, and you can correct me here if I'm wrong, but builder will cash flow the work being done, and cash flow in many instances a lot of the trade work actually happening.
Yeah.
Then they put a progress claim in, so the developer pays the progress claim. Then the builder then pays the balance out to the tradies, and the tradies will then give, I guess, the certificates to say, the frame's been done correctly, the slab's been done correctly, the plumbing's been done correctly. So if you're not getting those certificates, that's telling you that your tradies aren't getting paid as well, which is why I put one of the conditions in my contract to say, well, if you're asking for a progress claim, I want to see those certificates up front. I'm not going to pay my progress claim unless that certificate's there. That's a really big red flag to say tradies aren't getting paid.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, one of those areas where Victoria and Queensland might be a little bit different. So a lot of that stuff is sort of regulated by law here. The owner gets a copy of every certificate that gets issued from the building surveyor or private certified or whatever it's called in your state. But a lot of that stuff, it's pretty good indication of what's happening. Now, I take it a step further. If you see projects slow down on site and you don't know why, and your builder's not talking to you about it, I will assume that builder's in trouble. And I explain why. Stuff happens, right? Things get delayed. Sometimes it rains. Sometimes it gets muddy. Sometimes tradies get COVID. There's all sorts of reasons why projects get delayed. Yeah, happens to us. Happens to every builder out there, right? Now, when something like that happens to us, I know what you're going to assume, right? So I personally go on, pick up the phone, and give you a call and say, listen, you're going to see there's no one on site this week. We have this problem, right? This is what we're doing to solve it, right? Now, I can do that because I'm, that's kind of the type of relationships I have with my clients. But to be honest, it's also easier because I'm not going out of business. It's usually something technical happening, and usually we have a solution for it. A builder going out of business takes one or two approaches, right? It's either open and tells you what they are, in which case my recommendation is go work with him because you have something that is rare and that is good, yeah? Everyone can be in financial trouble at one point or another, right? Cash flow in building is hard, right? And your project, no matter what you think, is being financed by your builder, right? So if your builder is opening and having conversations with you about how he's struggling financially to finish your project, your best outcome is to work with him to go through it, right? And there's a number of ways of kind of doing that. But there's other builders that they go on retreat, right? And they start doing what we call the dodgy here, which is, they start getting your progress claim to go and pay the tradies to finish that other project, so then they can get into that other progress claim to hopefully come back to yours and do something else or somewhere else. That's a recipe for disaster because eventually the music stops, and we've all played that game, right? And you don't want to be the guy that ends up without a chair. So, again, relationship transparency and openness are probably the best things that you can find, with your builder. And it doesn't matter who your builder is, you can do more of that. And it's probably as much on your side to do more of that as it is on the side of the builder.
Which, if we sum all of that up in a nice, easy to digest kind of way, it's, look, you've got some contractual rights, but sometimes standing up for those rights isn't in your own best interests. And in the end, I guess it's a people relationship that it's actually going to get you through. So you want to make sure that you maintain those people relationships all the way. That said, those contractual rights, mate, are there any particular clauses that you're seeing that are now being added into contracts to try and protect these sorts of things from happening?
I've seen stuff from done to protect the developer, definitely, and I'll talk about a few of those. But let me talk about the builder side first. In Victoria, at least, again, might be different in other states, there's nothing. The regulation is super clear, and as much as I would like it to maybe be more balanced, the regulation is severely designed to protect the developer. And I understand why, right? So there's unfortunately too many dodgy builders out there. Now, let's talk about the clauses that you can put in a building contract to protect yourselves as a developer. And I'm actually going to take my builder's hat here out for a little bit and try to talk as a developer out of fair bit, right? So there's a few objectives that you want to achieve with some of these clauses. And I'll talk about those first because depending on where in the country you are, you might have to do them slightly differently to make sure that it complies with the rules and regulations in your state. To me, the first one is I want to make sure that the money I'm giving a builder goes to my project and not to anywhere else. It doesn't go to buy a Porsche or a Lambo. It doesn't go to finish his own house. It doesn't go to finish his own project if he's a developer too. I definitely don't want it to go to somebody else's project, right? So that's very, very easy to do in Victoria by putting a clause that basically forces the builder to direct the funds and might keep them isolated from every other project out there. Now, enforcing is a different issue because enforcing of all of these things in Victoria means you need to go to mediation and then to VCAT and then to the courts. And any of those things is probably going to cost more than any benefit you have. However, I find contracts provide a clarity that then you can have conversations over. And if someone's doing the wrong thing, you can very, very quickly pull them on it, right? That's number one, right? So number two, it's a version of what you were saying just before around making sure that you get, approvals, inspections, certificates, all that sort of stuff, either sent to you on request or sent to you automatically or sent to you by the relevant authorities. Again, every state will have a different version of it. Depending on the rules and regulations of every state. But every state out there probably has a way of achieving that. And it's all about providing you with visibility of, an independent party having a look at the work of the builder and saying, yeah, it's done proper, or well, there's some things that a conversation needs to happen, right? And then the third thing, it's all about visibility. This one is probably the hardest to do. It requires a stronger relationship with the builder, but it's definitely possible. I've had clauses put by developers in my contracts that not quite provide an open book thing because I don't think that's necessarily kind of commercially viable or beneficial, but that allows it commit me to the developer to provide certain level of information, again, either on request or regularly about where we're at. Things like, you should be able to get from your builder a program of what activities are happening when, to a certain level of detail. Now, it's up to between you and your builder to decide what level of detail is appropriate. But if you sign a contract and then you figure out you're running late whenever the contract said the houses were finished, or just because you think things are running wrong, you can't do anything at that point. Whereas if you know you're running late, you can have a conversation about how you recover that time, right? And usually in construction, if time means money, right? If a builder is going to get into trouble, the time gets impacted very, very quickly. Those three are probably the initial ones I would do, and then there's others that I've seen around out there, but I will start with those three first.
So there's an additional clause that I like putting into my contracts, Henry, and everyone knows liquidated damages is there as the big stick to hold builders to account if they're running late, right? And the builder's incentive is to keep that liquidated damages down as low as humanly possible. And the developer's incentive is to make it as high as possible to say, well, it's actually costing me holding costs and things like that. So nobody can you're not allowed to legally profit from the liquidated damages, But in order to incentivize the builder to, I guess, accept that higher rate, I like to also give a carrot. So you need a stick, but you need a carrot. And you say, well, if it's actually costing me, let's just say $500 a day holding costs, then if you finish a day early, why don't I give you $500 more for the build, right? Now when there's a resources conflict between my project and the next project down the road, builder's going to be more incentivized to actually come to my site, because if he finishes 2 weeks early, that's another couple of grand in his pocket. So that carrot and stick type approach, nobody wants to use the stick, but if it's the same stick that both of us use against each other, then I think it's okay.
Yeah, listen, so let me start by saying I wish every developer did that you're doing, right? Because it's a purest incentive, right? It aligns the incentive of both builders and developers in a pure way, and that's actually good, right? So if I finish early, I'm making you some money. Unfortunately, most developers out there, they want the stick but not the carrot, yeah? They definitely want, I haven't had one contract, I don't think, where we haven't had a conversation about what liquidated damages need to be and how they work and what number is appropriate. And by the way, the number depends on, there's people out there, you should have, $3,000. It doesn't really work that way. It depends on the project, it depends on the risk, it depends on the level of certainty, it depends on your level of holding costs, it depends on the amount of the project, right? So it's a whole bunch of things that need to go in there. But most people want to penalize the builder when they're late, but there's no incentive for the builder to be earlier. And so what ends up happening is the builder effectively cooks the contract, right? So it bakes in some of those incentives that you're talking about into the contract, because I said, okay, well, you want me to put $2,000 liquidated damages, so I'm gonna hypothetically assume that I'm gonna be 3 weeks late, so I'm just gonna put that in there, hiding in some kind of budget line item or whatever, because the reality is, the behaviors are going to be the behaviors. I like a version of what you do, Rob, which is I'm happy to talk about liquidated damages and change those numbers, but it has to be balanced, right? It has to be whatever is your penalty is my penalty, right? So if I'm going to pay $2,000 because I'm late, well, when you're late, you're paying $2,000 too, right? So, and that provides a sense of equity to the whole thing, as opposed to developer just banging the builder with a stick. That doesn't tend to work too well, or at least not for too long.
I agree. So, excuse me, two secs. Sorry, mate. I guess given the flexibility of materials in price points and things like that, looking at alternative technologies, alternative building materials and that sort of thing as substitutes, and working with your builder to say, well, is there something else that we can use? So are you seeing different technologies that are now starting to emerge? So for example, prefabricated frames or prefabricated bathrooms, or maybe there's Ecoblocks or some things like that to do the exterior. What are you seeing that's actually now been in the industry for a long time, but has not necessarily been palatable, and all of a sudden is starting to get a little bit of traction?
Yeah, listen, there's actually a few things. So on some of your audience, and I know Europe, have seen, I just came back from quite a few weeks in the United States, and you can tell by my accent, I'm sort of from that part of the world. My mom lives there, and I took the opportunity to go and meet a whole bunch of builders there, to go to a whole bunch of sites, see the way they build, and it's something we do fairly regularly, particularly with some of the rooming house stuff we do, with New York, Paris, a whole bunch of places. But this time we did sort of Florida and the Southwest. Visit a whole bunch of things, because there's always ways of learning, and it's pretty hard. Construction in Australia, it's all very similar, but when you go there, different things happen. And there's a few things that I kind of picked up that we're still trying to figure out how we apply them here, and more importantly, we still need to make sure that they're viable both in a commercial way for developers, but also need to make sure that it meets all the regulations and the building code and all those rules. So we're kind of working through that, right? But I'll talk about a few examples of what they do in Florida at the moment that we don't do here. The external walls of most houses built in Florida at the moment are built out of cinder blocks. Yeah. Now, people consider cinder blocks as those great concrete blocks that are often used in like basements or high-rise buildings. And it turns out that the reason why they do that is because it's a complete replacement for the external frame. So these houses don't have an external frame at all, right? That means that things like timber and a lot of those things become, less of an issue. If you have a look at your project, if you're doing one now, I suggest you have a look at it, and you'll realize that most of your timber is actually on the external frame. But if you don't have an external frame, that's kind of easier to do. Now, concrete blocks, they're not cheap, right? So, it still needs to be the right balance between the two things, and we're trying to determine what that balance is at the moment. So, do we do that, or we do the same approach using something different? The other thing that they do very, very differently, it's what we call roughings. It's effectively, the piping, cabling works for them very, very differently. They do it much more efficiently, and it's efficient not just in terms of cost of installation, but it's also very, very efficient, when things go wrong. One of the biggest challenges that I have as a builder is once the roughings are covered by plaster, any change is like $1,000, right? They work very, very differently than that. So now we're still trying to evaluate whether some of those things can be used here, but it's certainly making a difference. And some of the other things that I'm looking at that really, really have me excited, but then again, I'm a builder, so I'm a bit nerdy like that, is the way they operationally manage the site is very different to what the traditional builder and what we've been doing here for quite a while. Here we basically, for most of it, we take the approach of, put a temporary fencing, put a bin, a toilet, and then push your traders as hard as you can. I'm working with a group in the United States that had some interesting research that demonstrate that by slowing down construction, it actually accelerates completion. And it's based on some of the stuff that we've seen in the past with manufacturing and other areas. So all of those three things we're kind of working on. I'm very, very excited. Who knows? Maybe I get an opportunity to share some of those with your audience once I have something more concrete that we can talk to people about.
I've used other technologies in the past, like what they call Ecoblocks, which look like a cinder block, but it's actually made out of polystyrene for the external frames. And then you, concrete reinforce those with some Rio bars. So they're very, very quick to put up. And I guess once you core fill them, they've got all the energy efficiency ratings and that sort of thing, and structurally very, very fast to actually put up. Are you seeing those sorts of technologies start to become a little bit more popular?
Yeah, and maybe that's actually why I didn't mention some of those. Like some of those technologies we're using now, right? So we're using, we're using things like Hibble power panels for the external walls in a lot of the properties we're building. They're quick, they're fast, they're more energy efficient than anything else out there, which means that we save on windows and we save in insulation, we save in other areas as well. The challenge with a lot of those things is they need to be done properly and by the right people. So it becomes one of those balancing things where you go, this is great, it's great technology, it's cheaper, it's quicker, all of those things. But if you can't find the tradies to go and make it, happen, to execute it properly, you probably negated all the benefit. It did happen to me the first time I used one of those products. So you want to make sure you work with a builder that is looking at this stuff so in advance and is planning for it, rather than going, now that we're going to do the bricks, we should probably use this product. By then, it's probably too late. So, but yeah, they're definitely out there.
Very good, mate. Before we go to some parting thoughts, just want to give everybody a heads up that you're going to be presenting for us at our next Melbourne-based meetup. Now, I'm trying to think the dates off the top of my head, but I think it's the 2nd of April from memory. And you're going to be talking about some of those alternative technologies and also how to do your construction cost calculations when you're at early feasibility stage. So So if anyone is interested in that, make sure you come to our events page, register for that Melbourne-based meetup. Now, I've just put the link down the bottom for everyone. So it doesn't matter where you are in the country, you can physically turn up if you're based in Melbourne, or you can live stream no matter where you are in the country. And if you're watching this video after the 2nd of April, then I guess if you're an annual member, then you can also, I guess, dial in and watch the replay as well. So just that heads up for everyone there. Mate, normally we do these sessions live. Because we had the technical challenges, we clearly had a re-record here. So haven't got the opportunity to go out and ask questions from anyone. But is there any parting thoughts that you want to, I guess, give our community at the end of this, mate?
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, hopefully you guys have heard a little bit about, the perspective that someone like me as a builder kind of see in the market, but I'm also a developer, so I incredibly sympathize with all the challenges that we've all had as developers in the last 2 years. Your best bet now and in the future is to make sure that your builder is a partner in your project, right? This is not just a supplier. You're not buying a car. It's not a transactional thing. If you have a strong relationship with a builder that is there sitting next to you and taking care of your project as if it was his, you're going to get the best outcome out there. And it's actually not that hard to do. It just takes a little bit of time and a little bit of dedication.
Mate, with that is some very wise words. So, mate, I want to thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to seeing you at the next meetup in Melbourne, mate. So, thank you again, mate.
Absolutely, man. See most of you in the next 3 weeks or so.
Okay, thanks, Henry.